Um, you can obviously go back to the text if you do need some clarification. Hang on a second. It's wanting to download software right as I'm trying to do this. So, okay, let's get started here. All right, so let's remember a couple of the big topics here. So what I want you to do is to make sure you have this up. So as we go through here, if there's anything that you have concerns about, if there's a question about something, we're going to kind of go through here and make sure that that's clear for you. Because if you're struggling to understand the text and the themes in the text, and I'll admit it's a very difficult read. I've given this text out every year I've taught, and it's definitely one of the more rigorous pieces of text that we use. Okay, so this is not designed to be, this is a primary source that has some very, high level words, high level reading, style. It's a lot of this is Old English, which adds another element to it. Okay, so let's start. We're not going to break down every single paragraph, but there's a few that I definitely want to make sure that we understand here. So if you read through this and you're still kind of scratching your head about what we're looking at here, this is going to be very important to make sure that we see some of the themes here. Okay, so first of all, we know we're in a circumstance where we have a very difficult relationship between the colonies and Britain. And by the time this is published in January 1776, things aren't really looking any better, okay? And when this is published, as I mentioned yesterday, we have battles that have started during the Revolutionary War. It's my opinion as a teacher and someone who, looks at history a certain way, that a lot of times people say the American Revolution started when the war started. I don't think that's accurate, because a revolution is something that usually requires a conflict in many cases to get the end result that you're looking for, in this case, independence. But it wasn't as if we didn't have tension and rebellion before the war. We did. So I don't think that it's accurate to say that the American Revolution started when the war started. All right. So, but we do know that by January 1776, people are considering independence as a very possible motivation. Not everybody. We have some people that are very apprehensive about it, which is why Thomas Paine wrote this. This is designed to be targeting those people who are on the fence or need kind of a nudge in the direction of supporting independence. Okay. So when we look at this first statement right here, I didn't do a very good job of highlighting this. When it says mankind being originally equals, they're talking about from birth, okay? And one of the things that a lot of philosophers bring up is the idea of you're born equal, you're born at the beginning, everybody's the same, okay? And so what Paine tries to point out here is that from birth, we're all supposed to be the same. But what happens is that you're going to have circumstances in your life where there's going to be some differences, okay? Obviously, one of these differences is rich and poor, okay? That's something that happens naturally in life. It could be a circumstance where you may end up in one of those two categories, but you started out the same, okay? In some cases, that's really what we're looking at here, okay? But he's concerned that, excuse me, we have a situation where we have oppression occurring, which is the natural, it's what's going to happen when you are looking at the relationship between a king and their subjects, okay? And so this difference between a king and his people did not begin that way naturally. And he's going to point out why allowing a king to automatically give the power to their son, their offspring, is against everything that we look at in terms of the way, we start out as people being equal. Okay. Let's look at the second paragraph here. This kind of gives you a little bit more idea. Okay. And so king and subjects, he's really critical of this because he says right now, there's never been a bigger discrepancy between a king and his people. King's up here, his followers are down here. All right. And over time, that gap has widened and people have just come to accept that as the norm. Okay. And Paine is very concerned about that because that's not the way it should be. It shouldn't be that we have kings that feel that they are so much better than people, than everybody else. But it shouldn't be that the discrepancy or that difference is wider than it's ever been before. Because, if you look through Europe, monarchies are the norm. Okay. And so he points out the fact that we have natural distinctions, male and female, good and bad. Those are things we expect and to see all the time because they're a common part of life in society. But he says that the relationship between king and subject is unnatural, and even more unnatural is the idea that power or that difference is passed down from one generation to the next automatically without even thinking about it. Okay. And so when he says, when we add to the evil of monarchy, the fact that it's already an unnatural distinction, you've added another element to that when you bring in hereditary monarchy. Okay. And so he says, to the evil of monarchy, we have added that of hereditary succession. And as the first is a degradation and lessening of ourselves, so the second, claimed as a matter of right, is an insult and an imposition on posterity. Now, what is he talking about here when we see the word posterity? What does posterity mean? Somebody, if you know, raise your hand. And does anybody know what posterity means or what it's referring to? Eileen?
It means your descendants.
Yep, those who come after you. Okay, and so he says, in our current situation, we're dealing with an evil, but it's even worse if our offspring have to experience that same unfortunate circumstance and it's completely accepted as being normal. Okay. Because he says it's an imposition on posterity that they're having dealing with the same issue we are. And then he goes on to say, for all men being originally equals, no one by birth could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual preference. That means down the road, they're being better than everybody else to all others forever. Because you could have a situation where a family rules a country if everything works out correct and well over 100, 150 years, 200 years. And think about how many lifetimes that is. I mean, that's and that's part of the reason why hereditary succession becomes so volatile and so hated because, but also in Paine's mind, it's become so commonplace because it's just been accepted as, well, the next monarchy's in and he just happens to be the son of the previous monarchy and that's just the way it is. But he doesn't want that to be the norm. It shouldn't have to be the norm because one family should not automatically place themselves higher than everybody else just because that's the way they think it should be. Okay. And then he goes on in the next paragraph to say, if we have a circumstance where there's a decision that we choose a certain individual for our head, meaning our leader, it doesn't automatically mean that the same people are going to say that your children and your children's children shall reign over us, over ours forever. He's basically saying it's a situational circumstance where if we pick someone to be the king, it's not automatically assumed that their children should be our king just because of that original circumstance. So it should not be continuing down the line automatically because that's not what the original people would have intended if they choose someone to be the king. And we're going to get into what comes down to what are the reasons and how people are chosen to be a king originally. Okay. And naturally, and as you see this in here, you're going to have situations, as he points out, where one person could be a good king, but it doesn't guarantee that their children are good kings either. In most cases, if you have an abusive, tyrannical king, what is a child going to do? It's probably going to carry on the same legacy because they see that their father was successful and powerful in ruling a kingdom a certain way. Why would they change that? They wouldn't. Okay. So, it's not as if this is the way it has to be. And Payne says that even if people don't publicly show their frustration with monarchies being passed down the line, in private, they know they're frustrated, but it could be a situation where they may not want to speak out for what the consequence would be in that circumstance, okay? And then he goes on to say, this one where he talks about the origin, all right? The origin of kings, and what ultimately happens is then when people begin to question whether or not this situation is proper, what happens is the family in power says, well, that's the way it's always been, even though they can't find any evidence of that, because he says right here, wherefore hereditary succession in the early ages of monarchy cannot take place as a matter of claim, but as something casual or complemental. But as few or no records with extent in those days, and traditional history stuffed with fables, it was very easy after the lapse of a few generations to trump up some superstitious tale conveniently timed. So what it means is that if you're not finding any evidence that this is the way it was before, as the generations pass, you can convince people that this is the way it's always been, and they're just going to take your word for it, because either they don't know any better or they don't have any other evidence to suggest that something was different. Okay? And so that's how families, according to Payne, were able to keep their power for so long, is it just became so commonplace. And like, for example, if I, grew up in a monarchy that was the third generation of the same family, my assumption would be is that this was the way it was supposed to be, because accepted that as the standard norm. Okay? And then he goes on to say here that even though we've had a circumstance where we've had some kings that have been good, hath means has, known some few good monarchs, but grown beneath a much larger number of bad ones. So the bad heavily outweighs the good. Okay? And if you look at the way that, he talks about the fact where, an outsider came in by force, took over the land, and then made themselves king by, that is something that, where that king could be using that power to stay in, using that circumstance to stay in power, and then that becomes the norm, because who is going to stand up and address that as being something that shouldn't happen? Most people are just going to accept it as, because, how are you going to stand up to somebody who took power by force without someone else coming in and taking that power away from them? Okay. And so this is the part where I think it's really important that you see what's happening here. Okay. So really, this is the question of how did kings come about in the first place? And so what he comes up with, and by the way you see this word viz, V-I-Z, that's Latin for as follows. We have three circumstances here: lot, election, or by usurpation. Usurpation is what it's mentioning here in the previous paragraph, by force. Someone taking in, invading, driving the previous monarch out of power, and then ascending to the throne and setting up their family in power. Okay? Then you have by lot, which is like, for example, if 5 of you were given pieces of paper and 4 of them had green dots on the piece of paper and 1 of you had a red dot on the piece of paper, and someone says, among the 5 of you, who has the red dot paper? And someone would say, me, and they'll be like, you're the king. That's what lot means. It's basically a random selection. And then you have election. Okay? You have election, which we know how that works. We have people who vote for the individual that they want. But the problem is that if you have a circumstance where the elected official then essentially says that hereditary monarchy is set in motion, then you have transitioned away from the original, more democratic process of electing someone, and now you're in a situation where, well, my future generations and those who follow me are automatically going to take the throne because the election process is not needed anymore. And a lot of times, again, if you're the king and you hold that power, no one's going to stand up to you in that circumstance because there's going to be too much fear behind it. Okay. So again, those three, you know, and if you have a circumstance with a king who's in power for a long period of time, it's going to be very difficult to drive that person out. Okay. Because unless it's used by force by somebody else, which has happened obviously in many cases in history, there's not going to be a change. Okay. And so again, you know, this is a good sentence too. He goes, but it is not so much the absurdity as the evil of hereditary succession which concerns mankind. Did it ensure a race of good and wise men? It would have the seal of divine authority, but as it opens up a door to the foolish, the wicked, and the improper. And it has in the nature of oppression. So it's allowed people who maybe had good intentions originally to realize what they have in front of them, this opportunity to hang on to power and to make that power last longer. It changes them into someone who's power hungry and will do anything in their power to keep that. Okay. And then this one I think is a very interesting argument where he says another evil which attends hereditary succession is that the throne is subject to be possessed by a minor at any age. And this is true. Okay. Henry VI took the power at 9 months of age. Because his father died. He's the offspring, the only son. He takes power. Now, obviously, a 9-month-old can't do anything. So advisors and you know, people working within the close circles of the monarch are going to run things, but he is automatically ascended to the throne after his father, regardless of the age. Okay, so you have to admit that Paine, you know, he may be long-winded at times. Paine's arguments have some validity to them, and again, what he's trying to set in motion is a process that can not only work in the American colonies, but could work elsewhere, because we know that after Paine is involved with this revolution, he's going to go to France and have an involvement during the French Revolution in, you know, outing the king and the queen and allowing Napoleon to kind of take power over time. Okay. So again, we have to focus on the fact that if you're in a situation as a monarch currently, and he's obviously highlighting the current king, King George III, he sees in George III all the evils that he's mentioning here. And I think lastly, this part is a really very convincing argument. He says the most plausible plea which hath ever been offered in favor of hereditary succession is that it preserves a nation from civil wars. And when this true, it would be weighty, whereas it is the most barefaced falsity ever imposed upon mankind. The whole history of England disowns the fact. 30 kings and 2 minors have reigned in that distracted kingdom since the conquest, in which time there have been, including the Revolution, which he's talking about this one, no less than 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions. So he's using the current circumstance and the fact that we have American colonies in revolution against the king as proof positive that a king does not have any respect from the people. It does not have any circumstance of protecting the people, and it allows for the circumstance of this current situation where we have violence brewing in the colonies. So it's very much proving the opposite of what people are saying about it preserving civil wars. Okay. So I know that was a long-winded response to going through this, but I think unless you have an understanding of the themes in this text, you can't really effectively answer the question. Okay. So does anybody have any questions about what we talked about, or anything that anybody have any questions about the actual response questions at the bottom? Okay, so just to clarify, this is going to be due Monday. So Monday, I would prefer that this would be done and turned in before we meet because I really don't want to, we're not going to be able to spend a ton of time on these questions because we're on a good pace and we're going to be looking at the circumstances of 1776 and then the Declaration. All right. And we're going to be doing something with the Declaration. I've yet to kind of tinker with things specifically, but I want to do some kind of assessment of sorts. Speaking of an assessment, I've had several people email me, and I want to clarify because I did bring this up 2 or 3 times in the live session. The vocabulary assessment that was posted is not for the online section. It's only for the in-person section because I administered the test when they were in the classroom. Okay, so you are not required to take the assessment over the vocabulary. Okay, because there's not an effective way of doing that in our remote circumstances. Okay, so if you need assistance with understanding some of the themes, revert back to this recording. I'll try to get it recorded within the next 30 minutes, or not recorded, uploaded within the next 30 minutes to the course page. And, you know, if you have a question about something, you can obviously just send me a message and I'll be happy to respond as quickly as I can. Okay. Is there any other questions about anything before we adjourn? I always want to wait a second because I think there's a little bit of a delay in my message getting to you all. So, okay. So next week, we're going to recap some of the big ideas here in the text. We're going to talk about the circumstances of the Second Continental Congress, including the discussion on independence, what that means, and then we're going to break down the independence, what the 4 parts of the independence are the Declaration. We're going to look at the grievances that are compiled and how they represent a lot of the arguments that we have been seeing so far during this time period. And then ultimately, we're going to see what happens now that independence has been declared. And really that transitions us right into government, because we have 2 standards on government that talk about the origins of government originally when the declaration's issued. Because if you're declaring yourself an independent country, you're going to have to create some kind of government system. Okay. And the government system that we had originally is not the same government that we have today. All right. So we're going to talk about that. And as we get into government more, we are going to be spending several days talking about how an election works. We're not going to get into personal politics. We're not going to get into platforms of the candidates. We're not going to get into what's the difference between a Democrat and Republican. I'm not going to get into that, but we will talk about exit polls, voting eligibility, voting registration, electoral college, popular vote, all that stuff, so that you understand on election night what everything means. Okay. So I will talk to you again on Monday. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the assignment. Check out the recording if you do have any issues, and I will see you Monday at 12 o'clock. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.